we actually have 11 eyewitnesses to the Mormon golden plates, whose names and written testimonies we still have today. 3 of those witnesses say that they saw the angel Moroni give Joseph Smith the plates with their own eyes. And even when they fell out with Joseph Smith and left the church, they still continued to assert that they had witnessed these events.
And I think the very simple answer is that Joseph Smith and these early witnesses were charlatans. I'm sure that Alex would agree with that assessment, that these men were not sincerely mistaken that they had seen the golden plates. Rather, they were just lying about what they saw.
What's interesting is that the Gospel of Matthew, right there at the end, says that of the 11, right, the apostles that were still around, they worship Jesus when they have this resurrection experience, but some doubted. It was the other McDowell, Josh McDowell, who said, the resurrection proven beyond doubt. And that a modern day apologist would claim to prove beyond doubt something that we're told that the 11 doubted. I mean, the audacity of that.
Are you the Christ? Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? And Jesus responds, I am. And you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. A virtual quotation from Daniel 7.
It's actually a distorted faith that people like this have, in my view, right? I say this from my perspective as a Christian now, and this is not just me talking New Testament scholar stuff. I think that trying to prove what cannot be proved so that you can build everything is really an expression of this instinctive human desire that we all have. We want stability, we want certainty, we want confidence.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have James McGrath with us today. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing just fine, Derek. Good to be back on your channel and talking to you again. Been way too long.
Thank you. It has been a while, and look, there's been a lot of noise lately. There's been a debate discussion between a guy named Wes Huff, who's a Christian apologist. He's a Calvinist, who debated against Billy Carson, who is an enthusiast, UFO kind of paleo-contact kind of guy, and he's big into Zecharia Sitchin, which, isn't my conclusion, but I don't think it was a fair discussion in the way that Wes treated him. Then he ended up showing up on Joe Rogan because he made some noise, and we've done some responses. Well, William Lane Craig, the famous apologist, and Sean McDowell, the son of the famous Josh McDowell, did a response to Alex O'Connor from the major YouTube channel, used to be Cosmic Skeptic, and we're going to play some clips, and I just want academics to raw, hip-fire, address what you hear in your own words. I do not want to coax you. I do not want you to feel uncomfortable giving your own answer and your own conclusions. If you agree with them, you agree with them. If you think there's more nuance it. But of course, there's going to be a list of academics we're going to be covering who are going to be piggybacking off things not off what you say, but off what they say in their own words as well. Are you ready?
Fantastic.
Awesome. Let's have fun.
Wes says that Jesus was audaciously going around claiming to be God himself. I don't think that's true. Nowhere in Mark, Matthew, or Luke does Jesus actually claim to be God in his own words. At best, it's just in John's Gospel that divine claims begin to appear. I and the Father are one. Whoever has seen me has seen the Father. Before Abraham was, ego eimi. I actually still don't think even these count, and we'll explain why in another video, but let's just say that they do. Even if this was Jesus explicitly claiming to be God, don't you think it's a bit suspicious that these claims only show up in our latest gospel? If Jesus was known to be walking around claiming explicitly to be God himself, did the other 3 gospel authors just not think this was relevant? A minor, unimportant detail not worth including?
Essentially, here's the key question I'd love for you to weigh in on, Bill. To confidently believe that Jesus is God, do we need explicit first-person claims? And did Jesus adequately claim to be God in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which came before John?
In my published work, I've tried to show that historically, Jesus of Nazareth made highly significant Christological claims about himself, whereby he put himself in the place of God himself. For example, he claimed to be the long-awaited Jewish Messiah. He claimed to be the Son of God in a unique sense. He claimed to be the divine human Son of Man prophesied by the prophet Daniel. And all of these offices or titles come together at the trial scene in Mark's gospel. The high priest, the leader of the Sanhedrin, charges Jesus under oath, "Are you the Christ? Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" And Jesus responds, "I am. And you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." A virtual quotation from Daniel 7. So here you see claims that assert the divinity of Jesus by use of these significant Christological titles. And immediately the high priest and the Sanhedrin recognized the blasphemy of what he had said and condemned him to death.
So the problem there is that, on the one hand, supposedly this is a claim to divinity that's blasphemous. And on the other hand, what Daniel was describing was a second divine figure, right? And yet the high priest had read Daniel before, got where the reference was from, and presumably did not proclaim it to be blasphemy every time that he read Daniel, right? And so there's this fundamental tension in this way of treating the trial scene. And so it seems to me that if we listen closely to what William Lane Craig said, most of it is saying, claiming to be the Messiah, claiming to be the Son of Man who is enthroned in this way. When we read Daniel 7, it's talking about a figure to whom authority is given, right? And so if you want to say that this is an angelic figure, a celestial figure, a divine figure subordinate to the one supreme God, any of those are certainly options, as is also the messianic interpretation that we get not just in the New Testament, but in the parables of Enoch, right? One of the latest parts of the book that's known as First Enoch, where this figure, right? It's a human figure. So that Son of Man, that human being, is installed in this sort of celestial enthronement as Messiah to rule over all things, and all nations come before him and bow down before him, right? Using that word that's used in the New Testament that's often translated as worship. And this is a human figure who is exalted to what we might call a divine status, right? And that's what we see in all these places where Jesus is doing what people will say only God does, right? He does these things because God has made him, Jesus, the supreme agent and representative of God. And so saying that he acts with divine authority, lots of New Testament scholars will say that, but that doesn't mean that he is claiming or implying that he is the second person of a Trinity or something like that, right? Those concepts come along later, as some of these ideas that were around in the first century faced other questions and underwent some further development and debate and discussion, things like that, right? And so what's blasphemous, when we think about blasphemy, right? You think about blasphemy laws, they're not about, for the most part, they're not focused on people claiming to be God, right? It's about insulting God, right? That's what blasphemy is, first and foremost. And for this person that the Jewish authorities rejected, and from the perspective of the author of the gospel, who was crucified and so clearly could not be the one to restore the line of David to the throne, for him to claim that he's this figure is insulting God, right? He's putting himself in this place that he's not worthy of in their eyes. And so that's the issue. It is blasphemy in their, in the eyes of these characters in the gospel. Not clear that Mark had an inside source to know what happened at this scene, right, and what exactly unfolded. But he's trying to say something that seemed plausible. And what seemed plausible was that they would consider a claim by Jesus, whom they reject and don't think is the Messiah, that he will be enthroned in this way, to be not just a ridiculous claim, but one that is insulting to God.
Now, in addition to these explicit claims, there are also implicit Christological claims that Jesus made, whereby he put himself in God's place. For example, his claim to be able to forgive sins. In Mark chapter 2, we have the story of the healing of the paralytic. And Jesus says to the man, "My son, your sins are forgiven." And Mark records that those standing about murmured and said, who does this man think he is? No one can forgive sins but God alone. And Jesus, knowing what they're saying, says, which do you think is easier? To say your sins are forgiven, or rise, get up, and take your bed and go home? And he says that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. He says to the paralytic, I say to you, rise, get up, and go home. And the man is miraculously healed. Clearly in Mark's gospel, this is a claim to divinity, exercising authority to forgive sins, and authority and prerogative.
The claim to authority to forgive sins is explicitly made in terms of, that you may know that the Son of Man, right? The human being, right? With hindsight, after the way it's used in the New Testament and translated into Greek as an expression that was not in everyday use in Greek, Son of Man becomes a title associated with Jesus, but it's not a title in this time period. It's such a widely used Aramaic expression for human being that there's no way that somebody could say it and have it be understood in that way. I think what Jesus was saying was that he's, as we might say, because a son of man is someone, right? One. And so the same way that we use the one, right? You think of Neo in the Matrix, so some of those young folks might not get that reference, but hopefully you and I do. It's a claim to be that figure that's long awaited and so on and so forth. And it's really telling that in the Gospel of Matthew, who, as far as we can tell, is our earliest interpreter of Mark's gospel, the crowds hearing Jesus' words and seeing what he does draw the conclusion that God has given this authority to human beings, right? So that's what the expression means on Jesus' lips. And it was a claim that would have applied, right? And there probably had some questions and potential objections, not only about Jesus, but also John the Baptist, right? Who offered a baptism for the forgiveness of sins. And we see him being challenged and his authority being challenged because the question is, God has given a means of forgiveness through temple sacrifice and other things, and you are bypassing that. And so what's your authority? How can you claim to do this, right? And so, again, it is a claim to do something that requires divine authority. And what Jesus says explicitly in that passage is that God has given this authority to at least some human beings.
I would just add this really quickly before we move to the second one, that I think Mark has a very high Christology. So some of the implicit claims, like even in Mark 1, healing the leper, it's interesting in 2 Kings chapter 5, the king of Israel receives a request to heal Naaman of leprosy, and he says, Am I God? There was the sense that only God could heal leprosy. And of course, Jesus does it by his own power immediately without the ritual of Elijah. Go to Mark 2, like you explained, the healing of the paralytic clearly shows. I mean, Michael Bird wrote, he said, Jesus claims for himself an unmediated divine authority that to those steeped in Jewish monotheism looks like absolute blasphemous. You move to Mark chapter 4. Jesus rebukes the winds and the waves, and they immediately become calm. Well, the theme in Psalms is that Yahweh alone controls the sea and other waters. Hence, at the crossing of the Red Sea, we see that portrayed. The Gospels report the disciples saying, Who then is this that even the wind and sea obey him? This is reminiscent of the Psalms. Who is mighty as you are, O Lord? Two more quick examples just to make this, and these are only a few of them, as you know. The demoniac bows down to Jesus. Now, what's interesting in context is he was not showing respect, but fear on behalf of the large number of demons possessing him in the thousands. This army of 2,000 or more demons was deathly afraid of Jesus, and he falls prostrate in an act of worship of a supernatural power even greater than a legion of demons. And then finally, like you said, these implicit claims come to be explicit in Mark 14, where Jesus claims to be the divine figure, the Son of Man. And I think just to buttress this case, he comes on the clouds, divine status, served by all nations, and will have an everlasting universal kingdom. So I think the earliest Christology is a high Christology.
I don't disagree that it's a high Christology, right? And I want to reiterate something that Bart Ehrman has said, which is wonderful, that having a human being who's greater than Elijah, who's imbued with divine authority, who, according to this sort of hymnic passage in Philippians chapter 2, God elevates and highly exalts over all principalities and powers in heaven and on earth. They worship him, right, in the sense of bowing before him. Every knee shall bow and every tongue confess, taking language straight out of a key monotheistic passage from Isaiah. But ultimately, this is all given to Jesus. He is exalted to the status by the one God. And so all of this is ultimately to the glory of God the Father, right? And so, the point is that, even in the story of the exorcism, what the demons try to do, right? It's a really comical passage when you notice these things. They try to exorcise Jesus, right? To say, I adjure you by and invoke a higher power was how you tried to exorcise someone. And so the demons invoke God, right? I adjure you by God, right? It's a funny story, right? And it's supposed to be funny when you realize that the demons are trying to exorcise this renowned exorcist. What it's saying is that Jesus has an unparalleled authority, so that the only place you can go sort of to get a one-up on him is to try invoking God. And of course, the idea of demons invoking God as an attempted exorcism is hilarious, right? When you notice these things. But clearly, the invocation of God in order to try to get a one-up on Jesus says something about his status as well, right? That he has a status that is unparalleled, so that even demons are afraid, and yet it's not the status of the one God. It's a status given by the one God.
So that seems to be the distinction between what they're doing and what you're doing, is saying given by God, and of course, uniquely very close to God, but he is not God. You have this baggage of Trinity later that you're trying to, so if anything gives him any divine status, you just almost forfeit ground to them in their mind. They think, if he did anything divine, or if there is divine nature that gets attributed to him at all, they automatically assume the baggage of Trinity. I noticed this with apologetics.
Yeah. And I started to say earlier that, the thing I like that Bart Ehrman has said at some point, I can't remember if it was in one of his books or if I heard him say this, but that you can have this view that Jesus is exalted to rule over everything, subordinate only to the one God, and call it a low Christology, right? Because unless it's the Trinitarian doctrine formulated at Nicaea, then it's low, right? Even if you are exalted to above everything other than the one God, right? That's not low, that's high, right? And so it is a high Christology to make these claims about Jesus. It is, but that doesn't have to mean what they are claiming, right? A high Christology doesn't have to be a Nicene Christology, right? And if the Nicene is claiming something that is higher of Jesus, fine, but that doesn't mean that slightly less high is not high.
Anyway, Wes also mentioned how it was amazing that the early church grew from 11 scared disciples to overhauling the Roman world. On this, the sociologist Rodney Stark estimates that in its first 300 years, Christianity grew at a rate of 40% per decade, from a small group in the 1st century to 3 million in the 4th century. That sounds pretty impressive, until you learn that this is the same growth rate experienced by Mormonism since its foundation in the 19th century. So if the rate of Christianity's growth is good evidence of its truth, Mormonism just became a whole lot more plausible.
Here's the root of the question I'm curious for you to weigh in on. Is the amazing growth of Christianity a good argument for Christianity? If so, what about the growth of Mormonism?
Here, my sympathies are with Alex. I do not think that you can simply point to the growth in the size of a movement as a good argument for the truth of the founding principles of that movement. Islam would be another counterexample. Islam grew tremendously after Muhammad and took over much of the world, even threatened the Christian West. And so it's simply not true that the success of a movement is indicative of the truth of that, of what the movement stands for. Rather, in my published work, I've tried to recast this consideration in terms of explaining the very origin of the Christian movement itself. What I mean is this: we know that Christianity sprang into being sometime about mid-first century. Where did it come from? What caused this movement to arise? Well, all scholars agree that the movement arose because these earliest disciples had suddenly and sincerely come to believe that Jesus had been raised by God from the dead. And that raises then the further question, well, where in the world did they come up with that belief? And I think that the best explanation for the origin of that belief and the transformation in these first disciples is that they were right, that God had raised Jesus from the dead.
I think in fairness, Wes would agree with you. I don't think he was necessarily saying that this amazing growth proves Christianity is true. I think he's saying this requires an explanation from 11 scared disciples to overhauling the Roman world. So I really think it would line up with your point. Now, obviously, numbers alone are not, they don't prove that something is true or not. I mean, if stats are right, by 2070, Islam could be larger than Christianity. Does that prove it's true? Of course not. But I think we don't have to do this here, but we could look at some of the differences between even the growth of Christianity, completely unexpected in Christianity, versus the opportunities to grow in the 19th century with kind of a Christian framework in the burned over district, which Mormonism came from. We could splice some of those differences, but I don't think it's really relevant. The big question is what explains this growth? Yeah. And they consistently pointed to the claim that Jesus had died, risen from the grave, and appeared to them. I think that's the heart of it. Really, really well said.
Yeah. So it's fascinating that this whole discussion is focusing on things precisely in the sort of areas that I myself have written on, which is good because I love coming back to these topics. And I think there seems to be agreement here that you can't argue from success. There is something that definitely requires explanation in terms of how does this messianic movement continue to be a thing when it seems to have a failed Messiah at its center, right? And that certainly is something that requires a historical explanation. Historians, just by definition, are not going to be able to say it is because Jesus actually rose from the dead. But what historians can talk about is that they seem to have sincerely believed this, right? And so the notion that this whole thing starts with a bunch of people just concocting some stories and going around. I mean, there seems to be sincere belief at the heart of this. Although I suspect that Sean McDowell and William Lane Craig would possibly argue that there is not sincere belief in the case of Mormonism and Islam. And so it may be that, in actual fact, that their view of those religions undercuts it or requires them to acknowledge the sincerity of someone like Muhammad in a way that I'm not sure whether they would or not. But that would get us off on a tangent. I think that there are basically two ways that scholars of Christianity who are themselves Christians and yet who are trying to be honest with the limits of historical method and the evidence have dealt with this. One is that Jesus did not make the kinds of explicit claims that the Gospels attribute to him, and the disciples were puzzled and perplexed. There must have been enough in the teaching of Jesus about humility and that only if you want to be the greatest, you must be the servant of all. That would have allowed them to say he was following his own teaching, and that was God's path for him to become the Messiah. And then that they had dreams or altered state of consciousness experiences of some sort in which they perceived Jesus to have been raised. Right? Another possibility is that Jesus did expect that the kingdom of God was about to dawn, which meant the resurrection, and that his path was to follow his mentor, John the Baptist, because John had been killed. The movement was really shaken by this, and that he rethought what it means to be the Davidic Messiah in light of what happened, and said that he's going to need to be killed, and God will raise me, and that the disciples, according to the Gospel of Mark, they seem to have fled back to Galilee, but at some point there is an effort to see where the body is. Its burial would have been, according to Mark, in a tomb nearby, and so would have been a tomb used to bury those executed on the site. And so later Gospels try to make it a perfectly clean tomb, which no one has ever been buried and things like that. So the question of whether the tomb would have been closed properly so no scavengers could get in, whether you could identify accurately the precise burial niche in which the body was placed, if it was even given that, or whether it was just put in there among other corpses, whether there's a possibility of misunderstanding, it cannot be excluded historically, right? But if they were expecting, if Jesus had prompted them that God is going to restore me beyond death, then they might have had experiences, dreams, whatever else that could have persuaded them that God had indeed vindicated Jesus. And astonishingly, surprisingly, it was not as part of the general resurrection of the dead. History is still going on, but God has done this thing with Jesus, right? And so there's going to be this different scenario unfolding. And each of those possibilities is compatible with the evidence, right? What's interesting is that the Gospel of Matthew, right there at the end, says that of the 11, right, the apostles that were still around, they worship Jesus when they have this resurrection experience, but some doubted, right? And so it was the other McDowell, Josh McDowell, who said, the resurrection proven beyond doubt. And that a modern day apologist would claim to prove beyond doubt something that we're told that the 11 doubted. I mean, the audacity of that.
We actually have 11 eyewitnesses to the Mormon golden plates, whose names and written testimonies we still have today. 3 of those witnesses say that they saw the angel Moroni give Joseph Smith the plates with their own eyes. And even when they fell out with Joseph Smith and left the church, they still continued to assert that they had witnessed these events. We don't have anything like this kind of extant written testimony for the resurrection of Jesus.
Kevin Harris and I did a Reasonable Faith podcast on this question recently, and I think the very simple answer is that Joseph Smith and these early witnesses were charlatans. I'm sure that Alex would agree with that assessment, that these men were not sincerely mistaken that they had seen the golden plates. Rather, they were just lying about what they saw. I think that is the correct and plausible explanation of this circumstance. But notice that explanation, when you try to carry it over to the first disciples of Jesus, it becomes completely untenable. No scholar today would support the old deistic theory that the earliest disciples stole the body of Jesus and then lied about the resurrection appearances. So while this alternative, or explanation rather, is plausible for these Mormon witnesses, I think it would be completely untenable with regard to the earliest disciples of Christ.
There's 2 excellent articles and podcasts on this in the Mormon Research Ministry that Bill McKeever's put together. And he basically really summed this up well. He said, Mormons believe the 11 witnesses saw the golden plates with their natural eyes, but a careful reading of Mormon documents themselves actually reveals a different account. According to Doctrine and Covenants, the only way these so-called witnesses could be allowed to see the plates was with faith. Faith was a prerequisite to seeing them, which is interesting. There's deep contradictory evidence, whether it was with their natural or, quote, spiritual eyes, meaning it seems to be the claims were more of a vision than empirically, so to speak. So David Whitner himself said, "We did not touch nor handle the plates." So Bill McKeever concludes, and he has a very careful article. He cites all the early sources themselves. We can link to this. I'd invite viewers to go watch it. His conclusion is, while they all, the 11 witnesses, claimed to have handled what they were told were ancient plates, they did so while the plates were covered up and not visible. If Mormons want to insist that a person can't be considered an eyewitness to the authenticity of the golden plates unless they actually saw them, then there were no eyewitnesses to Joseph Smith's gold plates. I think that really captures it.
Let's say something about that. I think, and I say this as somebody who's wrestled with this. I have a book, The Burial of Jesus, which probably should have titled something else, because people are much more if it was like the cross of Jesus or the resurrection of Jesus. But precisely because it's the question of the body, right? And that in between period is a crucial one. We have stories in which, in the Gospels, in the New Testament, in which they encounter someone who they don't recognize as Jesus, but become persuaded was Jesus, right? And so there's room for doubt. I mean, obviously, there have been religious charlatans, and there have been sincere people who, at least most of the rest of humanity would agree were wrong, including other people who subscribe to beliefs with sincerity that they think have sincere origins. People like me who've had a profound religious experience, find that some evidence in that, but ultimately, one of the things that was part of my own journey was realizing that the fact that I've had this experience of sort of having a sense of peace come over me and things like that when surrendering to God doesn't allow me to bypass historical method and say this is what happened 2,000 years ago, right? And that's tough, right? If your worldview is constructed on you have to know absolutely without a doubt what happened in a particular tomb. We don't have in the New Testament accounts of what happened in a particular tomb. Right? We have people coming there afterwards. And so trying to prove what happened there historically is bound to bump up against the lack of information in there, right? And so we eventually get accounts of people touching Jesus, right? And even eating with Jesus, right? But those are not there in our earliest sources. And like some of the claims that may have said, okay, no, they actually saw golden plates, when in fact, in the earlier things, there may have been some ambiguity about it. I'm not an expert on that subject, so I don't want to go there. And so that I may be wrong about, they may be wrong about it, and I may be repeating what they said. But the point is, by way of analogy, right, our earliest sources don't talk about those tangible elements, right? And that's important, right? And that doesn't mean Jesus wasn't raised from the dead. It just means that if you're going to try and use history to prove it, you're going to be fighting a losing battle from the start, because historical study deals with probability. And at most, historical methods might be able to say, yeah, Jesus probably rose from the dead, right? Because all the other answers seem less likely than this one, right? And that's still not what these apologists are looking for, and those who are looking for certainty are pursuing, right? And so historical arguments are never going to give you that. And that's part of the method itself.
It's been my observation, Dr. McGrath, that the way they're James, the way that they are treating Mormonism, you mentioned, and I before we move on, I just want to make this point, that you had religious experience. I've had religious experience. I no longer consider myself a Christian or a believer, but I have religious or these same experiences as a skeptic today, with the love and the awe and wonder of the universe, and sometimes just go, is there more? Okay. But I don't need golden plates. I don't need an empty tomb. I don't need, you know what I mean? And so I respect your answer, because you might say, well, I had one in the context of this. What I find that disturbs me a little bit about apologetics, especially this kind, look at how quick they dismiss the entirety of, I'm going to say, the mythos of Mormonism. And I don't mean it derogatory. I mean it as in, this is their worldview, right? And look how quick they're charlatans. They're liars. Well, can we not historically come up with a plausible, even if you don't agree, a plausible explanations that maybe they did try to steal the body. I mean, I'm not saying they did, or someone else stole the body because grave robbers were a real thing. And we have the novel of Kalihari. Anyway, like indications, right? I could play this game using historical methods and come up with plausible explanations. And if you start with my presuppositions that it's less likely a dead dude who literally died rose, and it's more likely that a fake Nero imposter pretends to be Nero, even though Nero's dead, or a fake Jesus potentially imposter does appear, like we talk about unknown characters that show up on scenes, which I personally take as more mythical, looking at other theophany tales and things like that. Like, notice all of this. I can have fun. I don't need a answer. And listen, I love this stuff, but what is the way they quickly dismiss the humans?
Yeah, I have a couple of things to say about that, just even coming from a Christian perspective as well as a scholarly perspective, right? First of all, treat others the way you want to be treated. Somebody famous taught that they might hold in high esteem and be willing to listen to. And that's got to include, treat others' worldviews, beliefs, religion, claims the way you want yours to be treated. If you would be unhappy if people just dismissing, it's like the early Christians were charlatans, then treat the claims of others with more respect and sensitivity. That doesn't mean that all claims deserve respect, but just making these big, vast, sweeping assertions, is, I think, problematic. The other thing is that, one major turning point, so this was back in my sort of conservative evangelical days, was interacting with some Mormon missionaries, right? And they were determined to evangelize me and this pastor that I was living with at the time and spending time with and working with. And we were determined to do the same to them. And they talked about their own sort of spiritual experience and that God's Spirit confirmed to them, the validity of the Book of Mormon in their hearts and things. And I was like, you're not allowed to use that argument. That's our argument, And so the truth is that religious experience that sounds very similar crosses divides between religions and even between the religious and non-religious. And most mystical traditions in various religions, on the one hand, hold doctrines and dogmas as much more as symbols, as pointers towards this unknowable, ineffable reality. And on the other hand, recognize that in the different contexts of different worldviews and languages and symbols, the underlying experience is probably the same thing, right? An encounter with ultimate reality in whatever way, shape, or form.
But the Gospels are written in the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. And they're written in this period of time where you have groups of individuals who could have fact-checked those things.
Okay, it gets a bit speculative here. Scholarly consensus is that the earliest gospel, Mark, was written around 70 AD. This is some 40 years after Jesus died, and likely after the death of most of the eyewitnesses, given life expectancy in the ancient world. But even if it were written earlier, even if it were written by Mark himself, we're talking about the resurrection here. And notice that the earliest version of Mark's gospel does not contain any descriptions of post-resurrection appearances. It ends with the empty tomb and a disappeared Jesus and suggests that he will appear to people, but it doesn't record those appearances. So even if it's written by an eyewitness, it doesn't report anything about the resurrected Jesus. The most numerous and detailed post-resurrection appearances of Jesus are in the fourth gospel, the Gospel of John. Scholarly consensus states this to somewhere between 90 and 100 AD.
What do we make of the lack of the resurrection appearances in Mark? And then the numerous and detailed appearances in John? And then if you like, we can come back to it, but are the Gospels written in the lifetime of eyewitnesses who could have actually fact-checked them?
Mm-hmm. Mark clearly knows of resurrection appearances of Jesus in Galilee, for he has the angel say to the women at the empty tomb, "Go and tell Peter and his disciples that he is going before you into Galilee. There you will see him." So if Mark's gospel does end at chapter 16, verse 8, Mark doesn't care to tell us the story of that appearance, but he knows of such a Galilean appearance. Now, in Matthew's gospel, Matthew does provide such a story of the appearance to the disciples in Galilee. So I'm not really sure what Alex's point here is supposed to be. Mark's gospel provides very early testimony to the facts of Jesus' empty tomb, to an appearance of Jesus to the disciples in Galilee, and to the origin of the disciples' belief in Jesus' resurrection. So what's the problem? I don't think that Alex appreciates how incredibly narrow the window of opportunity is for legend to arise. Consider, by contrast, the earliest biographies of Alexander the Great were written by Arrian and Plutarch some 400 years after Alexander's death. And yet classical historians still regard these as largely reliable accounts of the life and doings of Alexander. By contrast, in the Gospels, here we have narratives of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection within the first generation after his death. This is far too narrow a window of opportunity for significant accrual of legend in this regard, while eyewitnesses were still alive and the apostles were in control of the testimony of Jesus.
So there are several things I want to say. And there's an extent to which I agree with William Lane Craig on one point, which is that there is often an inconsistency between how we treat these, religiously biased, but nonetheless, biographies of Jesus, and how we treat other sources from the ancient world that oftentimes still also are laden with, miracle and vision and all kinds of things. And I do think that on the whole, the early Christian movement was concerned with remembering Jesus, right? And was not doing whole-scale invention left, right, and center. And we see how some of the stories grow, right? Just as, Goliath grows, right? Not as we compare the manuscripts and look at how tall he is. We see how, Jesus making an attempt to heal someone and it doesn't work entirely the first time, gets dropped out, right? After Mark tells that story, how, miracles become even more impressive and various things. And so we get a sense that it's following the pattern, but it is rather early, right? And that's probably one reason why we don't have some of the kinds of fabricated storytellings that we get in later Christian Apocrypha, right? And some of the Acts of the Apostles, outside of the New Testament and things like that. I think the key thing to point out is that Mark indicates, right, and Paul indicates that some sort of experience of seeing Jesus was a decisive factor, right, in the survival of this movement and what it became and what its beliefs became and things like that. And Paul does not indicate, Mark does not indicate that involved, touching and, physical contact or something like that. And so whether it was visionary or something else is not clear. We see a trajectory towards corporeality that suggests that there was some discomfort in later decades with the lack of anything explicitly stating that in the earlier sources, right? The question of when and whether an empty tomb could have been fact-checked is really unclear, right? It is possible that some women went to the tomb and that Paul didn't mention this, or maybe even didn't know it because it was not central to his way of thinking about things. What mattered were the appearances to male witnesses or something like that. But Mark's gospel says that the male disciples have fled to Galilee, and there they will experience appearances. And whether the women in the story as Mark had heard it actually checked whether Jesus' body was there or not, or were scared off finding the stone rolled away, an encounter with an individual or something like that, it's not clear that there's any fact checking. And it's not clear how reliably one could verify that a particular executed individual is in this tomb and that that's his body in the darkness of the tomb and things like that. It's, to come back to something that was mentioned previously, I think maybe by you, but I can't quite recall. It's entirely possible that some group of disciples went and intended to remove the body, right? Jesus was dishonorably buried according to Mark's gospel. was given the bare minimum. They felt he deserved better, and they might have wanted to remove the body and treat it differently. They at the very least wanted to go and take care of anointing. And it seems to me that if they had succeeded in doing what they intended, that the story would have unfolded differently, and they would have probably told that story. And so that they go and fail to find the body because they see the stone rolled back and don't even enter, because they encounter someone on the way and interpret that person's words a particular way. There are lots of possibilities here, but none of them really constitutes what we would consider fact-checking and verifying in a way that doesn't leave significant room for other possibilities being entirely plausible. I would add one more thing, which is that anyone who has tried to clamp down on and debunk a rumor or some circulating misinformation, maybe at a time when there are plenty of people who can speak to it, it doesn't always work, right? And so we don't have evidence of who was fact-checking and in what way did they fact-check. But the later gospel tradition, the developing gospel tradition, actually tries to do this by having male disciples go to see what the women claimed, and women actually seeing Jesus right there in Jerusalem. But the scattering of the tradition, right? The fact that in Luke they're to stay in Jerusalem, and that's where they have the encounters and all these kinds of things. And in Mark and Matthew, they go to Galilee, and John brings both of those together. Clearly, there is something like Paul's tradition that people had experiences of seeing Jesus. And that was turned into narrative and sometimes set in very different places. And so claiming that these accounts give us the kind of historical information that would place the resurrection beyond reasonable doubt, it's not going to happen. And I say that as somebody who went to these sources hoping that they would provide that sort of thing. And I'm just being honest here that they don't.
Bill, I'm curious if you have a theory or an opinion about why Mark doesn't explicitly include these appearances. And in part, for me, it's clear Mark 8, 9, and 10, he predicts his death. He has predictions of his resurrection. Yeah. And my best guess is that Mark is kind of setting this up, saying, now what are you going to do about it? We've made it clear who Jesus is. Now anticipating his appearance, which by the time Mark was written, everybody would have known the story itself. It's almost like a challenge to the readers. What are you going to do with this pending appearance claim that's coming? Do you have an opinion on that at all?
I don't have a strong opinion because it is so perplexing that the story just breaks off after verse 8. But I think what you've suggested is not implausible. And it does leave the reader confronted with the question of how he's going to respond to this. But the key point, I think, is the one that you just made, namely, for Mark's readership and audience, they know what he's talking about. This is written ex post facto. So it shows that Mark knows there was at least one Galilean appearance of Jesus, such as Matthew relates. And so you have evidence in the Gospel of Mark for the honorable burial, the discovery of the empty tomb, a resurrection appearance to the disciples, and the origin of the disciples' faith. That's the heart of the case for the resurrection of Jesus.
Yeah, not an honorable burial, right? Mark's Gospel, Jesus was placed in a tomb, right, by a member of the ruling council, and it's only the Pietà, right, by Michelangelo, that's not part of that story or any of these, right? It's not the disciples of Jesus who get to do this. And one of the members of the council is said to be a secret disciple later when they're trying to also improve the burial, right? So that we go from anointing beforehand and an attempt to anoint afterwards that says clearly he was not anointed when he was buried. It was not an honorable burial, right? It's explicit in Mark. To the Gospel of John, where Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea bring like a wheelbarrow of spices, right, and give him a burial fit for a king, right? And so one thing that fascinates me is that the early Christians, even though they believed that Jesus had been raised from the dead, burial was so important, and honorable burial was so important, that they still felt the need to give him in literature a better burial than he had had in reality. And that in itself is fascinating. So, I mean, it seems to me that there's truth in the sense that, Mark's story breaks off abruptly, and it's not open-ended, right? If they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid, period, then you can't be reading this story, right? Because they said nothing to anyone, right? And so it's got to continue in some way. And it probably continued. My own view that I've expressed in a few places is that it continued with a story like what we find in John 21 and also at the end of the Gospel of Peter, right? One of the early post-New Testament Gospels, where Jesus is buried, the disciples flee, and in Galilee, they go back to fishing and they're on the shore and have some sort of numinous experience, right? And in John's version, they see someone and they're persuaded it's Jesus, but it also says they didn't need to ask him because they knew it was Jesus. And it's like, well, what was it about him that made you think it wasn't, or they might have doubts, right? And so there are puzzling aspects of this. Again, ones that help us understand why historical approaches these texts, even if you're trusting fully what they say and that they are giving us, a fully reliable account of what people experienced and things, we go back to the earliest sources and they just don't provide what, these apologists are trying to maintain that they do.
How significant is the dating of the Gospels for your case for the resurrection? Is it important that we get like Mark in the 40s or 50s, as some may try to argue? If it was in the 70s, would it really not affect kind of the core case that you're making for the resurrection?
No, it doesn't. Do you notice as the way I stated it just now, I said that these narratives go back to within the first generation after the events, which is extraordinary for ancient history. So we can accept that Mark was written around AD 70, Luke, Acts around 70 to 80, Matthew around AD 80. That still is within that narrow time frame that I described. Now, personally, though, Sean, I find the arguments that the book of Acts was written prior to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 to be almost compelling.
Oh, wow.
It seems to me that the conspiration of independent lines of evidence, all pointing to Acts, having been written before AD 70, is very powerful. And since Luke was written prior to Acts, that would mean that Luke was written then prior to AD 70. And if Luke used Mark, then Mark was written even earlier. And so I think this does push the dates back even further to narrow that window of opportunity for legendary development to an even more impossible narrowness.
It's interesting that on the one hand, you do have some conservatives trying to date things as early as possible, but factual information gets passed on sometimes for generations before anyone writes it down, and it turns out to be true. And sometimes stories are circulating almost immediately that are false, right? And so the timing doesn't tell us, right? We have to sift through these things. And I find it really interesting that a lot of scholars who came out of a conservative Christian background that just assumed everything is as early as possible, or maybe even used apologetics, there's a tendency to date things as late as possible and to be as skeptical as possible. And sometimes we really do go to another extreme further than is reasonable or balanced. While somebody who's not coming from that background, like James Crossley, might be like, yeah, I could see the Gospel of Mark being written in the 50s. It seems to connect with some of the things that were going on in that time. And, Mark 13 in particular make perfect sense in that context. Yeah. So when it was written doesn't tell us what kind of reliable or unreliable information the source had in and of itself, right? And so we need to look at each piece on its own. And the fact that Mark had generally good information doesn't mean that every single thing that's in Mark is good, right? It means that he was careful, but that doesn't mean that something that was false couldn't have slipped through. And so there's no alternative to just sifting through the pieces of the evidence one by one and evaluating each on its own terms.
One quick point on this. I think Wes Huff's general point is that these are not events that were done just kind of out of the public eye, but these are public events that people could engage and know. And especially if you're right on the dating of Acts, Peter says in Acts 2:22, men of Israel, hear these words, Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested you by God with mighty works and wonders and signs that God did through him in your midst, as you yourselves know. That is such an interesting claim that Peter preaches this to his audience. They know it because this wasn't done in private, but done in public. I think that's the root of what Wes is getting at, which in many ways sets Christianity apart from other faiths.
So Peter's sermon is, you know about what happened, right? He even accuses them, Jesus, whom you crucified, you were sort of part of this big thing, either through your direct involvement or, not standing up to those who were making this happen or whatever else. And it says to them, God raised him, not as though that is something that is public in the same way, right? And the accounts that we have indicate that the appearances are not to the general public showing them things, right? And so there is a public element to Christianity, right? And that's why we can indeed verify some things, right? We can verify that there was a movement. We can have some confidence that there was such a thing. It doesn't allow us to prove something like the resurrection.
There are dozens of non-canonical gospels that were written but didn't make it into the New Testament for all kinds of different reasons. Listen to what Wes Huff has to say about these gospels.
And so these books that were not included, are any of them interesting? I mean,
they're all interesting.
But does any of it seem like it belongs in the New Testament?
Well, so part of the problem with some of these other books is they appear to be almost completely reliant on the other books. So you do have, and some of them have an agenda to them.
Like, what? I'm just going to underline that. He just said of the non-canonical gospels.
Part of the problem with some of these other books is they appear to be almost completely reliant on the other books.
The problem here is with basically the first thing that anybody learns about the New Testament. Scholars think that Mark was written first, then Matthew and Luke were written later. Why? Because Matthew and Luke are reliant on Mark. And not just a little bit. More than 90% of Mark's gospel is also in Matthew's gospel. Mark has 660 verses in total. Over 600 of them are also in Matthew, often copied verbatim. It is undisputed that there is a literary dependence between Matthew and Luke and Mark.
Again, there's a lot here, Bill, but here's the question I'd love for you to weigh in on. Is Wes right that we can dismiss the Gnostic Gospels for having an agenda and for being reliant upon earlier Gospels? What should we make of the Gnostic Gospels?
Here, I think that Alex is needlessly unsympathetic to what Wes Huff was saying. The apocryphal Gospels, things like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Philip, and so on, do not appear until the second half of the 2nd century after Christ. And they are shaped by the pagan philosophy of Gnosticism. They do not evince a genuine historical interest in Jesus of Nazareth. Rather, Jesus simply serves as a kind of sock puppet, a mouthpiece for spouting Gnostic doctrine. What historical nuggets the Apocryphal Gospels do contain all come from the New Testament, which they know. So the Apocryphal Gospels are not useful as sources for the life and teachings of Jesus. Now, again, I want to ask, what is Alex's point supposed to be? Surely he doesn't think that the Apocryphal Gospels are reliable sources. Rather, he must think that Wes Huff's critique is correct, but that it would also invalidate the New Testament Gospels. But that inference, I think, is far too quick. Of course, the New Testament Gospels have an agenda. And of course, there are relations of dependency between them. Nevertheless, they do provide early, multiple, independent attestation to many aspects of the life of Jesus, and therefore are generally regarded as valuable historical sources for the life of Christ. To give just one illustration, take the burial narrative of Jesus, such an important event, the burial in the tomb. This is attested in the pre-Markan Passion story that Mark used in writing his gospel. It is also to be found in Matthew's special source material, that is to say, material that Matthew had that he did not derive from Mark. And it's also found in Luke's special material, that is material unique to Luke, which he did not derive from Mark or from Matthew. And then the story is also found in the Gospel of John, which is generally regarded as independent of the three synoptics. Go over to the Apostle Paul, and you find the burial mentioned in the very old tradition handed down by Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-5. And on top of all that, the burial account is mentioned in the apostolic sermons in the Acts of the Apostles. So look what we've got here. You've got 5 or 6 independent sources for the burial account, some of which are among the most ancient, earliest materials in the New Testament. And so these are incomparably better sources than the 2nd century apocryphal gospel.
Wes Huff was on with Joe Rogan 3 hours, and Joe is admittedly not an expert in these things. And Wes is trying to popularize certain points and wasn't able to expand. So it sounded like Wes was just saying, I dismiss the Gospels because they have an agenda and they're reliant upon earlier texts. And if that's what he was saying, then Alex fairly said, wait a minute, the Gospels also have an agenda. And Matthew and Luke, for example, are reliant upon an earlier text. So I think Alec fairly said, I'm not totally sure if I'm capturing what Wes communicates here. So I literally texted Wes to make sure I was understanding what his point was. And he clarified to me that he means the Gnostic Gospels are reliant upon established canonical Gospels. But rather than bringing the same message as, for example, Matthew and Luke do with Mark, they have a Gnostic agenda of incorporating their own pagan beliefs onto the earlier texts. So the agenda of the Gospels is to proclaim who Jesus is, and the agenda of the Gnostic Gospels is to appropriate Jesus for their own theological, philosophical perspective, which was foreign to the 1st century Second Temple Judaism and early Christianity. So I think that clarification really helps. And Wes's argument, if he's able to expand it, still stands.
Okay, I'm not going to get into Gnosticism. I have made a case for the origins of Gnosticism in the entourage around John the Baptist in my recent book, John of History, Baptist of Faith. I don't think that John the Baptist or Jesus was a Gnostic of the sort that we get in some of those later texts. And so in that sense, it does seem to be a different direction. It seems to be a different direction that was felt to be in keeping with, what Jesus and John had been about. Just as when Paul is saying, okay, so we're going to let in Gentiles and they're not going to be circumcised. Paul felt that what he was doing was in keeping with what Jesus had taught and meant, even though Jesus had not said, do this, right, in so many words in, anything that's attributed to him in, let's say, Mark or Matthew. And so, I think, there's no real disagreement here, and so we can move on. But I do think that there are some of the earlier New Testament, post-New Testament Gospels that could well have independent material, if it's possible that Matthew and John and others did, right? And so you can't say that it's possible in the case of these New Testament Gospels, right, when they're writing later, that some of what they did not derive from the earlier known sources must have come from other sources or from oral tradition. And yet somehow, once you get into the 2nd century, that ceases to be possible, right? If tradition can make it across decades, then it can make it across a few more decades.
So,
how do you fact check someone coming back from the dead?
Well,
how many people saw his body, right?
Well, Paul says that 400 people saw him all at once.
400 people saw the crucifixion?
No, saw the resurrected Jesus. Yeah, 1 Corinthians 15. Paul says that Jesus appeared to the disciples, and then he appeared to 400 people all at once.
Wes gets this slightly wrong, as Paul actually says that Jesus appeared to 500, not 400 people at one time. But this only makes it all the more amazing. 500 people witnessing the physically resurrected Jesus would be an amazing proof of his resurrection. Unfortunately, 1 Corinthians chapter 15 is the only mention we have of this event anywhere. It's not in the Gospels, nor in Acts, nor in any other historical source. So, what do we learn about this event from 1 Corinthians? Nothing. Nothing at all. Paul does write that, quote, he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, but that's it. We're not told who these people are, or why they were gathered, or when this occurred, or how Paul learned about it, or how he knows the number of people involved. Paul himself wasn't there. Is this just something that he heard about? From whom? When? We're not told anything about this extraordinary event.
There's a lot here again, Bill, but the heart of the question is I'm really curious your take on how valuable, central, and reliable is the appearance to the 500 as cited by Paul in the 1 Corinthians 15 creed.
Certainly, it would be very nice to have multiple attestation of this appearance. But it would be a misuse of the criteria of authenticity to say that because the appearance is not multiply attested, therefore it is unhistorical. The criteria of authenticity, like multiple attestation, dissimilarity, and so forth, can only be used positively to increase the probability of some event. But obviously, being singly attested does not imply that the event, therefore, did not occur. In fact, I think that we have really good grounds for thinking that the appearance to the 500 brethren did occur, because Paul goes on to say of the 500 brethren, most of whom are still alive, though some have died. That shows that this appearance was not just a meaningless cipher for Paul. Rather, he knew the people involved, and he was aware that some of them had passed away in the interim. Paul's mentioning that some of them are still alive can only mean the witnesses are there to be questioned. Now, why don't we have then an appearance or a story of this appearance? Well, think about it with me. An appearance to 500 people at one time would have to take place out of doors. For example, perhaps on a Galilean hillside where thousands of people had gathered to hear Jesus preach during his lifetime. The Gospels tend to focus their attention on the resurrection appearances in Jerusalem as opposed to Galilee. But a provocative suggestion is that the mountaintop appearance in Galilee, narrated by Matthew, could be the appearance to the 500 brethren. One of the interesting things about Matthew's appearance story is that unlike all the other appearances, which were unexpected and caught people by surprise, is that this one was by appointment. Matthew says the disciples went to the mountain which Jesus had appointed them to go to, and there he appeared to them. And it was, of course, in Galilee that thousands of people had thronged to hear Jesus. I think it's not at all improbable that 500 people might have gathered with the disciples on that mountaintop to wait for Jesus and to experience this appearance. And so it could be that we do actually have a mention of this appearance story in the Galilean appearance story in Matthew.
As a whole, my take is there's multiple appearance accounts. We have different accounts to the women. We have accounts to the two disciples in Luke 24, the Emmaus disciples. We have multiple accounts to the disciples with Thomas, without Thomas, James, Paul, etc. And we have the 500. So it's a piece of a cumulative case, and we can make I think Alex goes too far in saying, what do we learn from this event? Nothing at all. I think that's too skeptical. I don't think Wes, I think he was just simply citing this as, hey, do we have appearances of Jesus? Here's one example. Would have given others. So we can be too critical, but we can also be too confident in it. To me, it's a piece of a larger case that just strengthens the appearances of Jesus.
Yeah. No, I don't think it strengthens anything, because it's true that something being singly attested doesn't invalidate it, right? I mean, one person being the source of information doesn't mean that they are lying, right? Just because that's the only place you've heard it. On the other hand, if we wanted to make a claim for a miraculous appearance, right? Even saying, okay, we're not speaking historically here, we're just talking about sort of criteria of evidence more generally. We need to know something, because the Corinthians could not verify this. I mean, did Paul, Paul presumably was not one of those. So had he heard this story? I mean, in theory, he could have been making it up. I have no reason to think that he did that, but it's possible that he might have wanted to reassure the Corinthians and thought a little white lie won't hurt. Maybe somebody told it to Paul. If it was that mountaintop experience from Matthew, that's the one where we're told, and when they saw him, they worshiped, but some doubted, right? And that in itself, I think, is interesting and noteworthy. We're also not told what kind of appearance was it, right? Was it, looking up at the sky and seeing something that, they couldn't quite explain? Was it, there are any number of things that could have been interpreted as a vision of Jesus. And we have, modern day visions, things at Medjugorje and other places where lots of people say they saw something happen and we don't know what to make of it. And so, there are things that we can't explain. They don't serve well as positive evidence for any particular, belief system or practice. They certainly are intriguing and worth talking about. If one's going to talk about them, one has to talk about them fairly across, not just differences of denomination, but of, geography, religious tradition, and other things as well.
And even if the 500 people did all believe it was Jesus, how many of them were already predisposed to think this? Remember, sometimes groups do claim to see visions, such as various apparitions of Mary, or the Roman Emperor Constantine's vision of a cross of light in the sky, which may have been seen by his whole army as well. The source isn't clear. Look at this image. This is a picture of a crowd in Fatima, Portugal in 1917. This crowd, many more than 500 in number, were witness to the so-called miracle of the sun. A prophecy by 3 shepherd children said that the Virgin Mary would perform a miracle on the 13th of October, causing this large crowd to gather on that day. And the miracle happened. Testimonies from the members in the crowd were published in the newspaper. They claimed to have seen the sun dancing in the sky, zigzagging around, and even advancing towards the earth, all for 10 minutes. So, a large crowd witnessing a prophesied miracle, and we actually know who saw it and precisely what they saw. We even have their direct testimony. Does Wes Huff believe in this Catholic miracle? Do you? And if not, why not?
So I'm really curious your take. How do we respond to group visions of the Virgin Mary?
I think here Alex is drawing our attention to a very important point, namely the antecedent beliefs of persons which would dispose those persons towards certain experiences. Like Alex, I am skeptical of the Marian mass appearances. The person who experiences Marian visions are typically Roman Catholics predisposed toward belief in the Virgin Mary. And so for exactly the same reason, I wouldn't lay too much emphasis on the appearance to the 500 brethren, who were probably all Christians. It's interesting that Paul refers to them as brethren, 500 brethren. So these people were probably already Christian believers, and therefore predisposed to believe in Jesus' resurrection. And so I wouldn't lay too much emphasis on this. As you said, Sean, it's a piece in the puzzle. It's part of the cumulative case. I think the really important appearances are the appearances to Peter and to the 12. These early appearances were completely contrary to antecedent Jewish beliefs, which predisposed them not to believe that Jesus was risen from the dead. One of the most remarkable things about the belief in the resurrection of Jesus is that the earliest disciples who suddenly and sincerely came to this belief were predisposed by their first century typical Jewish thought forms completely against it. And so this is one of the major factors crying out for explanation with respect to the resurrection of Jesus. What N.T. Wright has called these mutations in Jewish belief about the resurrection that were necessitated by believing in Jesus rising from the dead. This is not a natural evolution of antecedent Judaism.
Now, if I understand Alex's reasoning correctly, he's saying, if we have this appearance of the 500, then we would need to adopt these Catholic visions of Mary. And since many people don't accept those, we should question the 500. I would say, well, all right, if we accept the 500 and be consistent in his eyes and accept the Marian apparitions, then you and I, Bill, would just need to maybe consider becoming Catholic, but he would need to completely shift his worldview and open it up to the supernatural, which would be far more jarring to him than it would be to you and me. But nonetheless, I think you're absolutely right. The predisposition changes everything. I think it's fascinating. We look at the accounts of the disciples, like Mary sees Jesus, doesn't really understand, like what is going on when they view him. The disciples on Emmaus, even when Jesus is there, they don't understand. So they're predisposed to the opposite. And you and I have to explain the apologetic question. If that really was Jesus, why didn't they believe? And so I think that predisposition, when you're told ahead of time, there will be this supernatural event, everybody shows up in a group. I think we have an adequate explanation for this that doesn't apply to the apostles.
But I'm glad that William Lane Craig said, honestly, that the case of the 500 sounds like it could be the same sort of thing, right? And so I'm gathering that Sean McDowell, although he mentioned it as perhaps a direction that things could go, is not going to seriously consider converting to Catholicism. In terms of the mutation of Jewish belief in the resurrection, what happens is the early Christians become persuaded that Jesus was raised from the dead as part of the final resurrection of all human beings that's expected as part of the end of the current era and the arrival of the age to come, but that he's raised, to use Paul's phrase, as the first fruits of that general resurrection. And there was no expectation that one person would be raised apart from the rest. And so it is striking, right? And clearly their experiences that led them to the conviction that Jesus had been raised and vindicated by God led them to mutate their thinking about the resurrection, right? And so, but the question of whether, if McDowell and Craig say that Jesus said that he would rise from the dead, then that is interesting in terms of the psychology of religion. And did that predispose them to, maybe, not be able to locate his body in the tomb and think certain things, or, go back to Galilee laden with guilt and have dreams or experiences, spotting someone on the shore and thinking it looked like Jesus, right? Like just standing in the same place where we first encountered him. And then they get there and maybe he's God or something like that, or it's too dark to really see him. And so they're not sure who they're seeing, but they interpret a certain, all of those are possibilities, right? And I'm not saying that those are necessarily the, what's probable, but when other things are seriously possible, then it makes it impossible to make a case for, okay, this is, we can be 100% certain, 99% certain of this.
So first is Peter. There are two epistles in the New Testament attributed to this apostle, 1st and 2nd Peter. Importantly, most scholars do not think that Peter actually wrote both of these texts, especially 2nd Peter, which is one of the most disputed texts in the New Testament. They're still early texts, but probably not both written by Peter. At least one of them is likely a forgery. There are scholars who defend the Petrine authorship of both epistles, of course, but the consensus is against them.
So we've talked about the appearances to the 500. We can talk about the appearances to the disciples. But what confidence do we have in particular for an appearance of Jesus to Peter?
The fact of a post-mortem appearance of Jesus to Peter is guaranteed by the list in the very old tradition handed on by Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3-5. It is vouchsafed by Paul's personal acquaintance with Peter. And then also in Luke 24:34, we have independent verification or attestation of this appearance. So no scholar today doubts that Peter had such an experience.
Part of the question is, do we just trust certain witnesses who we have a writing in their own words saying they've seen the risen Jesus? So Joe Rogan asks about people who witnessed the resurrection, or it is attributed to them as witnessing the resurrection. That was a piece of the discussion. So in 1 Corinthians 15, this is not Peter's own words, but it's Paul in an early creed referencing Peter. But we could also add there's multiple attestation of this in the different Gospels and, of course, in Acts. But what's interesting, and this would take us aside here, is that if Mark really does report some of the eyewitness account of Peter, as some of the early church fathers indicate, then in Mark 16:7, it says, tell his disciples and Peter, would be an interesting, at least indication in that direction, that Mark and Peter is just firmly aware and proclaiming that Jesus did appear to him. So I think that was some of the debate as it goes to 1 Peter. But nonetheless, for the reasons that we mentioned, although we don't have Peter in his own direct words saying this, given the early multiple accounts that we had, you're arguing that we are on solid ground confirming that there's early evidence for an appearance to Peter, and Peter believed this. Is that fair?
All right. And that this is unanimous among New Testament scholarship. I remember the skeptical German New Testament critic Gerhard Ludemann saying that it is historically certain. Now, those are his terms, not mine. It is historically certain that Peter and the earliest disciples had experience of Jesus after his death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. So no New Testament historian denies the historicity of the appearance to Peter.
Yeah, I mean, Peter had some kind of experience. I mean, his, again, whether it was precipitated by, guilt over betraying Jesus and other things, despair at having spent this time following him around. And now, John died, John was executed, Jesus was executed. All of that has to be part of a historical, psychological, human explanation of what happened. It doesn't rule out the possibility of the divine, right? It's just, but that Peter had an experience, it seems like everybody agrees, and we can move on.
Second is Paul. There are 13 epistles in the New Testament attributed to Paul, but many of these are also believed not to have actually been written by him. The consensus is that 7 of them are undisputedly his, whereas the rest are contested. Some, like 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, are firmly believed to be pseudonymous, written by somebody else. But even if Paul wrote all of these letters, remember what we're looking for here. Remember what Rogan asked.
Some sort of a recollection or a writing or something that's attributed to them of being witness to his resurrection.
Paul never claims to have encountered the physically resurrected Jesus. Even his conversion story in Acts just describes him seeing a flash of light and hearing the voice of Christ while on the road to Damascus. He never even claimed to meet the risen Jesus in the flesh, which I think is what Rogan is looking for here.
Do we have reliable testimony that Paul saw Jesus in the flesh, not just as a vision or a spirit?
Well, now, in the Apostle Paul, we have the testimony of someone who claims to have actually been an eyewitness of the risen Jesus. His experience is recounted 3 times in the book of Acts, and is confirmed by Paul's references to it in his own undisputed letters. Now, I'm not really sure what Alex means by seeing Jesus in the flesh, since it's the testimony of the New Testament that a resurrection body is radically different than our present mortal bodies. I think that the question is whether Paul saw simply a blinding light and heard the voice of Christ speaking to him, or whether he saw the bodily form of a person who spoke to him. And it's really hard to know exactly what Paul said. The evidence is not clear. But when Paul says elsewhere in 1 Corinthians, have I not seen Jesus, our Lord? He uses exactly the same language that is used to describe the bodily appearances of Jesus to the other disciples. And so I think it's not at all unlikely. In fact, I'm kind of leaning in the direction of thinking that what Paul saw was the bodily image of a man in that blinding light that was the Lord Jesus.
Now, just for clarification, I think Alex says Paul never claims to have encountered the physically resurrected Jesus. Those are the words that he used. The way I asked it to you is just in terms of seeing him in the flesh. But here's my take, and tell me if you agree with this. Luke recounts Paul's conversion 3 times in Acts, like you said, and indicates there was sound and light, so this is not entirely a subjective internal experience.
Right.
1 Corinthians 15:8, Paul says, last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. So his appearance would have come after the ascension of Jesus and thus had some differences from the other appearances, but Paul believes it was sufficient to place it on the same level and seemingly kind as the other disciples, which leans me towards some kind of bodily appearance that was there, but maybe with not just as much confidence as some of the others. Is that a fair nuance to you?
Yes, I think that would be a fair assessment, Sean. It's very clear that Paul regarded this experience on the Damascus Road not as a vision of Jesus. He had visions of Jesus at other times later in his ministry, but this was a unique one-time encounter with the risen Lord on the Damascus Road. And therefore, as you say, he's able to include himself in the list of witnesses to the resurrection appearances with a good conscience.
Yeah, so just a few quick points. The accounts in Acts, even though it's telling the same story, and it's supposedly Paul telling the same story, there's a discrepancy about whether those who are with Paul hear but don't see, or see but don't hear, which is interesting. And that was one of the things, noticing that in the text was one of the things that just killed the whole notion of inerrancy for me, as I was wrestling with some of this stuff. Paul says that he had an experience that, as far as we can tell, is of the same type as the others. And so you can argue that, well, everybody saw bodily, but in our earliest gospel accounts, that's not clear either, right? It's only as we get into Luke and John, towards the end of the process, that there's emphasis on the physicality, the bodily character. It's also interesting that Paul says flesh and blood will not inherit the kingdom of God. And in the resurrection scene in Luke, Jesus says, touch me and see that I'm not a ghost, that I have flesh and bone, right? A spirit, a ghost does not have flesh and bone, right? And so the question of whether this was fleshly, and Paul would have said, yes, but resurrection flesh is different. And so, it's clear that the early experiences in Paul's mind indicate that Jesus is not just up and walking around in the way that a resuscitated person might. So,
and just for clarity, when they're emphasizing body, they're emphasizing physical, they're emphasizing this kind of resurrection, can we glean the early sources and kind of walk away thinking it may not have been anything like the experience they're describing later in John and Luke, in your view?
That's entirely compatible with the evidence, right?
And there's a similar problem with the fourth name that Wes mentions, James, whose epistle in the New Testament, again with some dispute over the authorship, also simply does not recount his witness to the resurrection. Wes is wrong to bring him up as well.
Here's the heart of the question, Bill, is we don't have the words of James in his epistle, even though there's debate about whether he wrote that or not, which is somewhat secondary. We don't have words of James himself saying, I've seen the risen Jesus, like we do with Paul. So do we have reason to believe, which Wes Huff cites and believes that James is a reliable witness of the risen Jesus nonetheless.
The appearance to James is attested in the old tradition handed on by Paul, and it is vouchsafed by Paul himself, who knew James personally. Moreover, I think the appearance is historically plausible as the best explanation for why James, who did not believe in his older brother during his lifetime, suddenly became an ardent follower of Jesus afterward and was even martyred for his faith. So you do not need to have a person's own words describing his experience in order to be historically confident that that person did, in fact, witness such an event.
So I have sympathy for Alex because he's responding to certain books in the New Testament specifically that Wes laid out in terms of Jude and 1 Peter and James. I think that's why he's bringing in the apostleship here. But really, the key point that I think Wes was making, and maybe if he went back and had that conversation again, he might frame it and defend it a little bit differently, is that James is a reliable eyewitness of the risen Jesus, even if we don't have his own words saying that he's seen the risen Jesus. As best I can tell, there's actually 3 sources that are cited here. Of course, 1 Corinthians 15 that you cited, 7a. But John Dominic Crossan also cites the Gospel of Thomas 12, which is interesting. Even Gary Habermas is not persuaded by that. And then the Gospel of Hebrews, which is dated kind of the first half of the 2nd century. Now, I don't put a lot of credence in those. I think the main source is 1 Corinthians 15. But would you say, like, how, I guess I'm curious, how high would you rate our confidence in the appearance of James compared to Paul, where we have his own testimony, or Peter, where we have multiple accounts of it? How much historical confidence would you put in the appearance to James?
Well, I think it's right up there near the top. And of course, Paul is indisputable because we have letters from this man in which he talks about the appearance. But with respect to James, as I say, Paul knew James. He met with him during a 2-week period, just within 3 years after his own conversion on the Damascus Road. And James and Peter were telling him that they had seen Jesus risen from the dead. And this was then mediated to Paul as well by this very old tradition that goes right back to the first few years of the Christian church in Jerusalem. So we're in contact here with someone, namely Paul, who spoke with James and tells us what he believed. And James then became the leader of the New Testament church, and as I say, was eventually martyred for his faith in Christ. Now, that's remarkable enough in itself. But when you reflect on the fact that James wasn't a follower of Jesus during his lifetime, you've got to have some kind of explanation for this transformation in James that took place. The crucifixion of his older brother wouldn't do it. That would only convince him more deeply that his messianic delusions were insane and brought about his demise. What would produce so transformative a change in James that he would now be willing to die for his belief in Jesus Christ? And I can't think of any better explanation than Paul's words. Then he appeared to James.
We do have some, first of all, I appreciate Sean McDowell pointing out, despite what was said earlier in the video, that not all of the 2nd century stuff is Gnostic and not all of it is, antithetical to some things that even modern day apologists might be sympathetic to, which is interesting to have them bring those in while earlier they were being so dismissive of them. We don't know that James was sort of at odds with Jesus during Jesus' public activity. Jesus refers to dividing families, and that may have been his own experience. The Gospel of John makes sort of a blanket statement about his brothers not believing in him, but is that all of the brothers? Right? We have Mary depicted as being part of this early gathering in Acts, right, which is fascinating, right? And so the idea that his family was completely, at odds with him, not clear that we have that. I would just add that if the letter of James is early and authentic, which I've heard some very good arguments against that, but it also is hard to imagine why anyone would forge this, because it doesn't seem to be arguing for anything that addresses any issue from a later time, which is what forgeries usually did. But if it was authentic, then it shows us an example of a Jewish faith that incorporates reference to the Lord Jesus and is not focused on resurrection and end of the age stuff in the way Paul's was. And so it could well be an example of a very different route that some members of the Jesus movement, some branches of the Jesus movement were taking that we don't, it doesn't become the dominant form, and so has left much less trace than, for those of us with historical interest, we would love to know more about that branch and what else was part of it.
Thank you so much for your time, Dr. James McGrath. If you were to put a bow on the box, what is your takeaway from listening to the apologetic responses today, and what would you encourage the viewer who's watching to do in research, or maybe based on what you heard? Yeah,
those ancient people had some sort of transformative experience. You and I have had some amazing experiences that fill us with awe and wonder. I would encourage people to seek out those if they've never had them. Not necessarily, doesn't involve changing your worldview, right? It involves opening yourself up to the fact that we are part of something bigger, and the fact that there's mystery to that, and there's a reverential awe about the sheer fact of existence that's appropriate in response to that. And so pursue that, and it will actually, hopefully, take away the need to try to force the evidence to prove something that it's simply not capable of. It will also take away the need to try to argue that science is wrong about this and the other because it seems to be at odds with the Bible. The Bible cannot provide what those who idolize it, right, and essentially are putting it in the place of God and are making it inerrant and infallible and so on and so forth. And it's actually a distorted faith that people like this have, in my view, right? I say this from my perspective as a Christian now, and this is not just me talking New Testament scholar stuff. I think that trying to prove what cannot be proved so that you can build everything is really an expression of this instinctive human desire that we all have. We want stability. We want certainty. We want confidence. And I think that it's mostly people who've never had that kind of wow experience that gives them a glimpse of this thing is accessible to me and I'm part of it, and there's meaning to be found in the here and now, that leads people to look for some kind of decisive argument that can prove that thing. And so that would be my sort of closing remark, I think.
Thank you so much. I can't wait to see how different it's going to be lined up with you and all the other academics at the end of the day when we do play the clip, and just to hear the different opinions and critiques without you knowing theirs and without them knowing yours. Yeah. So thank you so much.
If the compilation thing of the greatest hits becomes big, you might release some of the deep cuts and do the, because this whole conversation I think has been good and could be useful. So.
Oh, I'm actually going to publish this as a standalone, and then the compilation as a buffet.
Okay. Yeah. Yes. Okay. Oh, that's gonna be good. Yeah. Best of both worlds. Fantastic. Well, it's been great talking with you, and I hope we do it again soon.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Never forget, we are MythVision.